This is Eitan Weinstein.
And I'm Naor Menninger, and you're listening to Two Nice Jewish Boys.
Dr. Einat Wilf has never been one to shy away from challenging the status quo. Born into a Labor Zionist family, she grew up believing in the dream of peace through compromise and coexistence. But her time working in foreign policy, education, and politics led her to some tough realizations. Over the years, she's become one of the loudest voices pushing back on what she sees as dangerous illusions, both in Israel and abroad, about the nature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Through her books like The War of Return and her public speaking, Dr. Wilf has become a champion of pragmatic Zionism, unapologetically advocating for Israel's right to exist and thrive in the face of ongoing rejection. While Einat Wilf shifted gradually away from the Israeli left, on October 7th, countless Israelis made a similar shift, only drastically. The brutal Palestinian attack not only took thousands of innocent lives, but also shattered the belief for many that peace is just a matter of compromise. People who once held on to the hope of coexistence are now questioning everything. This shift, echoing the journey of Dr. Wilf, grapples with hard truths about the conflict and what it will take to secure Israel's future. Today, we're sitting down with Dr. Einat Wilf to talk about her journey, how October 7th has changed the conversation in Israel, and what she thinks lies ahead for Zionism, the conflict, and the Jewish people. Dr. Wilf is a former member of the Israeli parliament, a prolific author, and one of the sharpest minds on these issues. We're thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Einat Wilf on the Two Nice Jewish Boys podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
So let's start, I guess. We talked about the major shift that you kind of went through gradually. On October 7th, did anything shift further? Did anything change? Were you not surprised?
October 7th did not cause me to shift in my understanding of the Palestinians, of the ideology that I've come to call, after October 7th, Palestinianism. But like many, of course, I was surprised by our failure. I think, like many Israelis, I was surprised by the scale. But in terms of the idea that this is what our enemies wanted, no, that I knew.
So the brutality of the attack did not catch you off guard?
I'll say something about the brutality. When The War of Return was translated into English, so the book came out in Hebrew in 2018 and in English in 2020. So in the English version, we realized that we can't just do just a translation of the Hebrew version. Some things we need to expand for an English-speaking audience. So for example, we had to expand the chapter about the War of Independence, about the War of 1948. Because we realized, and I don't think I'm caricaturing it too much, that to many in the West today, Israel's War of Independence looked something like this. There was the peaceful state of Palestine populated by cheerful peasants. And then came evil Zionists who already in 1948 had F-16s and tanks and proceeded to invade and conquer the peaceful state of Palestine and ethnically cleanse its cheerful peasants. So I don't think I'm actually caricaturing this too much. So we realized that in order to begin to even explain why people became refugees as a result of this war, we need to describe the war and what the war was like. So Adi and I, my co-writer Adi Schwartz and I, we decided to be very graphic and to actually include very specific details of what the war looked like, the butchery of the various convoys. For example, we described that there was a thriving trade in photos of desecrated Jewish bodies. So burnt, mutilated Jewish bodies were photographed And then the photos would appear in the markets of the old city, and they were very popular. So, for example, the GoPro cameras and the Telegram channels were merely an update of the technology, but it was not new.
Wow.
So even that is not new.
Wow, I was completely unaware of that. That's insane. Are there other examples from the book of brutality that took place beyond just, taking photos or, because that's not something that's discussed a lot about, the two sides of the war and how it played out back then.
Just that literally nothing about October 7th was unique. Again, the technology was updated, but the idea that the Palestinian vision of return, right? The book is called The War of Return. And for many people, this was a harsh name because people imagined, still many do, that when Palestinians speak of return, it is this innocent nostalgia to a great-grandparents' long-lost home. But if you look at the Arab texts from the 50s, the 60s, this is how they describe return. We will tear out their hearts out of their bodies, their fingernails from their feet and hands. So their descriptions of how they shall exercise this idea of return are incredibly graphic, violent. They include a desecration of the Jewish body. That is part of it. So for us, we always knew that this is part of the vision. This is why you had this euphoria on October 7th, and we knew that it existed. Since October 7th, I read Oren Kessler's excellent book, Palestine 1936. You see the brutality, the fighting already there. I'm now reading Yardena Schwartz's book on Ghosts of the Holy Land about the Hebron massacre of 1929. So once you read all these books, you kind of zoom out and you see that there is a century of brutality that every time we kind of compartmentalize it or isolate it, but it's a pattern.
And so you weren't very surprised on October 7th. And what about the weeks and months after?
So here I was both surprised by some things, but also encouraged.
Let's start with the immediate days, because we had you heard people like columnists like Tzvi Cheskeli who said we should have killed 100,000 Gazans in the first week. I'm quoting him, and others were happy with our response.
So first of all, I would say that I was surprised by the utter and total collapse of the structure of the state of Israel, not just the military defense. The entire state essentially was missing in action. Mm-hmm. There was no state to be found in any way, shape, or form. But also in terms of our policies, I felt that we caved too soon, especially on the one thing that the two things that I think have to the present we're still stuck with. The first is that when President Biden came here, and you will remember, we felt that we were going to be slaughtered from every direction. We don't appreciate the extent to which we are the incredibly lucky beneficiaries of the mistake of our enemies, and especially Hezbollah and Iran. People now try to make October 7th appear no big deal, like I wasn't a serious threat to the state of Israel. It very much was. We know what Hezbollah had. We know it was about at least 100 times what Hamas had, and Hamas did 1,000 times what we dared imagine. So imagine that on that day, Sinwar's plan, which was well thought of, that Hezbollah would have joined with everything they had, that Iran would have joined with everything they had, that the Arabs of the West Bank, the Arabs within Israel would have risen up. I'm not sure we would have survived that. And that's not so, it was there. The fact that Hezbollah ultimately did this wishy-washy thing where they kind of attacked us, but not to the full to their full ability, that's their mistake. And ultimately, we benefited from them making that crucial mistake. So President Biden comes here. We all remember we thought we were going to be slaughtered from every direction. He says, don't. And he describes the evil that was unleashed on that day. But then he goes on to say, but Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians. It's really important for him to separate all the descriptions of evil that he just went through from the Palestinians. He wants to keep them pristine. So he says Hamas doesn't represent them. And Israel succumbed to that and agreed to play along with the lie. And that was a terrible mistake.
What's the lie?
The lie is that Hamas does represent the Palestinians. Not only does it represent them in kind of the general sense that they were elected and that they're Palestinians, and like the Palestinian Authority says, having refused to condemn October 7th, they say they're part of the Palestinian fabric, which is true. But it's deeper than that. Hamas represents, again, what I've come to call Palestinianism, the ideology, the identity that is unfortunately common to nearly every Palestinian, a singular obsession with the non-existence of the Jewish state. Hamas is merely the most brutal executor of that, perhaps the most successful to date, but they represent the deepest Palestinian ethos that whenever you're faced with a choice, you can rule Gaza for the benefit of your people. You can turn it into the pearl of the Mediterranean. You can really make it the beginning of greater things to come. You actually make the choice to use that piece of land literally as a launching pad to destroy the Jewish state, or at least to attempt that. So Hamas represents the deepest Palestinian ethos, which is why on October 7th, you had euphoria. And the euphoria wasn't breaking out of prison. You know, now they have all these images. I'm sure I've seen them on Twitter. Gaza was so beautiful. Yeah. Look at what they destroyed. So it's always like that. They'll tell you one lie, and then that lie will be revealed, and then they'll have another lie. So the lie was it's an open-air prison. Now it's revealed, so now it's genocide. But, like, it's always lies. But the euphoria you had on October 7th wasn't because they were breaking out of prison. They would have gone to the border with Egypt. The euphoria was because they finally saw the vision of return. You actually have videos of people saying, we are returning, this is happening. Mm-hmm. So as far as they were considered, Hamas was executing what they wanted for decades, for over a century.
And they had actual plans to they were stopped relatively close to the Gazan border, but their goal, we know today from intelligence, from reports, from documents, was to continue the invasion and create this line between Gaza and the Judea and Samaria.
Exactly.
And
to
reach
connect
as far
with the West Bank, which is not so far.
Yeah.
And ultimately, they were inspired by May 2021, when Arabs within the borders of Israel kind of rioted. So they were inspired by that, to the possibility that they will do so again. So,
but how do you know that this is the Palestinian sentiment?
Because they say that. That's the remarkable thing about them. When I describe my own process of figuring out what they wanted, I described the moment that I realized that they were telling us all the time what was their choice, what were their priorities, but we just didn't listen. Or that when we listened, it sounded so outrageous that we didn't take it seriously. We assumed it's bluster. We assumed it's a negotiating position. We assumed, given other circumstances, they would change it.
How so? How were they telling us?
So let's start with, sometimes they directly say that, right? They'll go to like a demonstration, and they'll be like, we don't want
Chanting.
2 states, we want it all. They'll literally just say it. But typically you see it in this idea of return. The reason that I focus on it so much is that this is where you really see what they mean. So, for example, during the 90s, when we negotiated for peace, Palestinian leaders said 2 states. They said the phrase 2 states. Now, we, the Jews, made the assumption that one of the 2 is the Jewish state. In retrospect, a crazy assumption. We should have checked. Because when they said 2 states, they meant an Arab state in the West Bank and Gaza, and another Arab state to replace Israel through this idea of refugee. They're not refugees, return, it's not return, but the idea of millions of Arabs settling in Israel, and thereby making it an Arab majority state, essentially from the river to the sea.
By the way, doesn't it drive you crazy still now when you hear in Channel 12, in all those media, when they call Jabalia refugee camp?
Yes, every time I have to say, no one there is a refugee, and it's not a camp.
Everyone says it, even in Israeli, even right-wingers in Israeli media, still, it's like a habit.
Yes.
Force of habit.
Yes. So every time I have to say, not refugee, not camp.
Yes,
Because, but again, the fact that they keep it, the Palestinians insist on it, really tells you what their vision is. Another example, a few years before October 7th, there were the marches of return. I don't know if you remember them, right? Those were these marches / riots.
Which the Supreme Court prevented the army from, rightfully,
So I'm not going to go in there because I've been reading conflicting analysis of that. But what I do know is that they were marching on Israel, never on Egypt, and they called it the marches of return, right? So first they were very clear.
Soldiers died.
What?
Soldiers
I remember.
died.
But they were very clear on what they called it, right? The marches of return. So they call it that. And in that context, I invented a word that got into the book, which is West-plaining. West-plaining is when Western diplomats and journalists explain away what Palestinians say.
That's a good one.
So there was a journalist who did a video piece, and he's asking the Palestinians on the way to Israel, what are these marches for? So they tell him, from the river to the sea, this is ours, we're going to take it back. One boy who's 15 says, I'm from village so-and-so. Now, he's 15. He was born in Gaza. He's not from village so-and-so, but that's what he says, right? So, and they all say the same thing. It's all versions of the same thing. And then turns around this journalist to the video and says, they're demonstrating against the dire conditions in Gaza. And I remember noticing it in real time and thinking, this is literally the one thing they didn't mention. These were called the marches of return. They were not called the marches for more electricity in Gaza. And again, return is not some nostalgia. Return is, right, we will tear their hearts out. It is this violent triumph and invasion into Israel. So they've always said it. We just didn't listen.
But you mentioned the negotiations and you mentioned the marches, which, there were thousands, maybe tens of thousands. I don't know if there were more than tens of thousands. And so there's obviously a very strong sentiment amongst a significant portion of Palestinians. But what tells you that it's so prevalent, that it's something almost pervasive through Palestinian society?
That you don't hear any other voices. That was actually, for me, the moment that I understood that we've been telling ourselves comforting stories. Oh, there's the extremists and there's the moderates, there's this and that. So for me, the moment was when Arafat walks away from a clear and concrete opportunity to have a state of Palestine, no occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites. Good that President Clinton finally spoke up, because our prime ministers kind of let it slide. So it was on the table. It's on the table in 2000, Arafat walks away. It's on the table in 2008, Abu Mazen walks away. Now, what was interesting to me in both instances is that not only did they walk away, there were no dissenting voices. None. You did not even see some third-grade Palestinian activist living in London, in case you want to claim that there's a problem to do so in Gaza or the West Bank, who wrote an op-ed, right, in some small paper that said, what's going on? Are you crazy? We're on the verge of getting everything we've wanted. Go back there and get us our state. So sometimes people like to make excuses, part of West planning, and they say, look, Palestinians can't really speak up. It's a tyrant society and all that. I'm like, oh, they spoke up. There was plenty of dissent in Palestinian society against Arafat, against Abu Mazen for daring to negotiate. But when they walked away, there was no criticism, which means that both Arafat in 2000 and Abu Mazen in 2008, in walking away from a clear and concrete opportunity to have a state, they knew they were fulfilling their people's wishes. And as I'm going through this process, this is like you mentioned, for me, it took about a decade, this process. So I'm beginning to question. I guess they don't want a state. I guess it's not about the end of the occupation because all of that was on the table and they didn't take it. So what's going on? And during this time, I'm invited to meet Palestinians. They're called moderate Palestinians. They're from the PLO, the creme de la creme, educated, best universities, the British, the American universities. And they tell me things like, the Jewish people are not a people, only a religion. And the story you have about being connected to this land, you made it up to steal our own. So they do one and one, and they say, look, you're not a people, you don't have the right to self-determination, certainly not here, in a land to which you have no connection. And I'm going back from these meetings and I'm thinking, these are the moderates. So again, something is off. So I'm beginning to wonder, maybe I met the wrong kind of Palestinians. So I begin to do a search, which by now has lasted 20 years of my life. And I'm not sitting at home. I meet.
It's like, where's Waldo? Where's the moderate Palestinian?
Yeah, well, no one has yet described it this way. So I found 3 Waldos in 20 years. 3 Palestinians who will clearly, publicly, will say, we recognize the equal right. I'm not greedy. I'm not saying exclusive or superior. The equal right of the Jewish people as a people to self-determination in their historic homeland. We understand we're not refugees. We understand there's no right of return into the state of Israel. 3.
Who are they? Can you name them?
Yes. One, his name is John Aziz. He's very active on Twitter, and you're welcome to follow him. I even actually did a podcast with him together with RFK, who was interested, RFK Jr., who was interested in the prospects for peace. Mohammed Dajani, who's a real courageous person. He took his students many years ago to visit Auschwitz, basically lost his job, had to leave Palestinian society. And then there's a couple more. It depends who you count. But
do they live in the PA?
So John lives in London. He's actually half and half, one Palestinian parent, one British parent. Mohammed Dajani is from East Jerusalem. Sometimes I think that the reason that he could subscribe to this vision is that his family was entrusted by the Ottoman Empire with guarding King David's tomb. So maybe like for him, there is an ability to acknowledge that,
because it would be suicidal to hold such opinions if you lived in Jenin or in Ramallah, not to mention Gaza.
Fine, then in Columbia University. I mean, I'm wherever you may be, but at one point I'm done making excuses. Because people bring me polls and they say 20%, 30%, 70%, they want a 2-state. I'm like, I'm sorry. If a society has 30% of people who want something, then there should be at least 5 people who are willing to say it. Otherwise, something doesn't compute.
Yeah, too bad you didn't work for Kamala in the last elections. You could have helped her analyzing some polls.
So I wanna talk for a second about Israeli society at large and how it's kind of mimicked your journey. So how do you see the shift that's been happening or that's happened since October 7th?
So I'll use, if you allow me, the vote on UNRWA in the Knesset as a prism. One of the things that I've discovered over the year about UNRWA is that it's like a magic window that allows you to see a lot of things before everyone else. Through UNRWA, I was able to see that the Palestinians are serious and that there are no exceptions through this idea of return and perpetual refugeehood. I was able to see how addicted Israel was to the lie of quiet, that we can purchase more minutes of quiet by bribing Palestinians. I was able to see that through UNRWA. I was able to see the Western indulgence of this Palestinian vision. So I think UNRWA has now afforded me the ability to understand something about the shift in Israeli society.
UNRWA, to those who don't know, it's the UN's refugee, how would you define the organization? But they're dedicated specifically to the Palestinians. Yeah. That's the only
So
refugees.
UNRWA is essentially the Palestinian mechanism, with the camouflage of the UN, but it's a Palestinian organization devoted to keeping the idea of return alive.
Mm-hmm. But funded by the UN?
No, because it's not officially part of the UN, it's a temporary mechanism that still gets renewed by the UN General Assembly. They need to be separately funded from countries. So recently, the Israeli Knesset passed legislation forcing the government of Israel to end its voluntary cooperation with UNRWA that has been enforced since after the Six-Day War, since 1967. Now, there was no need for legislation to be passed. The government of Israel could have done that on its own, but it didn't. So the Knesset, in a remarkably rare moment, actually did its job. And I have to emphasize how incredibly rare is what happened in the Knesset. The Knesset passed legislation on a core diplomatic issue. This is not some small issue for Israel. This is not like, the Knesset passed a law, dedicating a day to a singer. It passed a law on a core issue for the Israeli government. It did it against the wishes of the government. Netanyahu didn't want this legislation. He was not there during the vote. He was trying to run away from it. It did it nearly unanimously. Opposition, coalition, wall to wall, except for the Arab parties. And it did it also against fanatical international pressure from friendly countries, the US, UK, France.
And I think another thing is it did it in a political environment where an opposition will vote against its own interests if the coalition brings, meaning
the people, exactly. There were no games. Everyone actually voted on the issue. I can tell you that I don't remember the last time the Knesset did something like that. And I think what this reflects is that a gap has opened between where the government is, and I would say some of the military, and the people. So I think what happened is that the government refused to budge, and as well as the military. They wanted to keep working with UNRWA, despite everything that we know. They wanted to keep working with it. And I think what a lot of members of Knesset began to see is that the people were not there anymore. The people were not willing to continue to operate by rules that we had that brought us to this mess. But the government was still stuck and the military was still stuck thinking that it's okay. So all this is to say, through the prism of this vote on UNRWA, I think the people of Israel are in a very different place now. It still does not have political, you still don't see it in the polls, you still don't see it politically, but things are shifting, things are moving, and I think...
To the right.
No, not to the right. I would call it to a certain, I would say, a common understanding of who our enemies are, which used to be common to everyone, and then we kind of lost it. So I think there is a greater clarity now among most of the Israeli public about who our enemies are, what they want, that what they want is not negotiable. It's not a negotiable demand.
Sorry to push you on that,
Go ahead.
But isn't that notion who our enemies are, the Palestinians, whether they want to kill us all. Those notions are inherently right-winged notions, at least in today's, maybe not in the 50s, but today that's right, because the left, it's all raison d'être is there are good Palestinians. We have to have peace with the Palestinians. If the Palestinians are our enemy, we by definition can't make peace with them. So if the people move to that direction, it means that the country is going rightward.
So I want to challenge that, and you alluded it also a bit when you said in the 50s or 60s. You know, sometimes when I tell my story, people say, oh, you've moved to the right, or you've changed your opinions. And I say, look, it's not that I've changed opinions. You know, I liked blue and now I like red. I'm like, it's empirical. And that's why I focused on 2000 and 2008 and 2005, the disengagement. We had a hypothesis, and you're right, that hypothesis was associated with the left, that the only thing that stands between us and peace is a Palestinian state. Get out of the West Bank, Gaza, all this stuff. But generally, there's a path to peace. The only thing that stands between us and peace is a Palestinian state. That was a hypothesis. Now comes the part that everyone likes to forget or willfully erase. This hypothesis was tested. It was tested repeatedly. Barak in 2000, Olmert in 2008, the disengagement by Sharon in 2005, it was tested. And then it failed spectacularly. So then a new hypothesis emerged that became part of my research in the War of Return, that I always bring this quote by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II, where basically says the conflict between the Jews and Arabs in the land is irreconcilable because the Jews want a state and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. So this becomes my alternative hypothesis, that the conflict is not that what stands between us and peace is a Palestinian state, but what stands between us and peace is the Palestinian identity or ideology, what I've come to call Palestinianism, the complete devotion to the non-existence of a Jewish state anywhere between the river and the sea. So for me, the goal is still to have peace. The only thing that has changed is my understanding of what stands between us and peace. And for me, that's an empirical issue. It's not a political position. It's an empirical issue that more of us now understand. I think the people of Israel remain as deeply committed, interested in peace, are willing to go to great length to achieve it. But
so what stands between us and peace? The Palestinian people.
Not the people, their ideology and their identity.
What's the difference?
The difference is the Homo sapiens who hold this identity, they can change their identity. They can change their ideology. Let me put it this way. Despite this very narrow strip of land, all 14 million people can live here. There's no actual objective problem, not enough land, not enough resources. Human ingenuity takes care of that. So the Homo sapiens can live together. But if one group of Homo sapiens holds an ideology that says that the others cannot live as sovereign, as free, as equal, that's the problem. And that's the ideology that has to die. So the ideology has to die, not the people.
But I don't see how that's a refutation of what Noah was saying about that. That is the perspective of the right wing historically, at least in the last 20 years, that, that's not going to get us there. Meaning the right wing always wanted peace as well, right? But they thought that the way to peace
they even
was,
made peace.
If you want peace, prepare for war. That was kind of and the left wing's perspective approach was, if we want peace, we need to sit down and talk and find a way to
give up.
Peace.
Give up on.
I agree with everything you said, but how is it not a shift to the right in the sense, and putting economical, social, welfare stuff aside, because those divides I do believe still exist, and I don't think October 7th necessarily changed them in any way. but in the hawkish sort of foreign policy approach.
So I want to, because this is also a question for myself, I sometimes challenge. If the right was truly those who view our enemies are as devoted to our non-existence, why did they fear so much to challenge it? Because, and this is why I say that it's not all moving to the right in itself. Because, for example, if supposedly a right-wing minister can say Hamas is an asset, right? Why is it an asset if you genuinely understand that the Palestinians are united in their non-negotiable worldview that the Jewish state cannot exist? Why do you fear to challenge it? Why do you fear to expose it? Why do you fear? So, for example, I would want, and this is where I think we are criminally delinquent, because I said that the Palestinians will lie on a lot of things and change one lie with another as soon as it is revealed. The one thing they never lie about, and I checked it again and again and again, is that they cannot accept a Jewish state. They've learned to use formulations, phrases, language, but they don't lie. If you push them, if you ask the specific questions, they do not lie. So we are criminally delinquent in not using that because it's there all the time. So I want a prime minister who wakes up every morning and says the following: good morning. I understand the international community has the memory of a goldfish, which is why I need to say this every day. Otherwise, people would have remembered that we repeatedly try to make peace. So I want to remind you today as well that the day that Palestinians end their century-long war against Zionism, the day that they develop a constructive vision of wanting to live next to us rather than from the river to the sea, the day that they understand that this means that they're not perpetual refugees and that there's no such thing as a right of return into the state of Israel, they'll discover, as has been the case for the last century, that we were never the problem. That we are always willing to live side by side in peace, in two states even, as long as one of the two is the Jewish state. Thank you, and see you tomorrow. So what do you call this speech? Right wing?
Science fiction?
Left wing? The speech itself is science fiction to you?
Yes.
Why? That's interesting.
Because it goes back to what you said also earlier, because the notion that those Homo sapiens would one day wake up, peace and loving 60s and hippies, and that's all. Why can't we all live together in peace? It's science fiction. I mean, maybe one day it will happen, but let's assume that in the upcoming 100 to 500 years, it probably won't happen. So let's work with that instead of living in deluding ourselves and the world that such a reality might exist sometime.
So here first of all, I challenge on a couple things. The first, the speech itself, I think we should make it, because I think it is incumbent upon us every day to make it clear that in any vision of peace, solution, agreement, we, except for our existence, have never been the problem. And I think it's important every day to emphasize it, especially since I said the other side is such great allies in clarifying that. Now you ask, so I think the speech itself is not science fiction. I think it's necessary that we have a leader who says that. But in terms of even believing in that possibility, that is a fact of, again, the Homo sapiens. Human beings change, both individually and collectively, in terms of their ideologies, identities, beliefs. We now believe in things that we didn't believe 20 years ago, and we look at people who believed them 20 years ago as backward cave people. I often, after October 7th, brought the example of Germany, Japan, after World War II. Societies change, ideas change. Precisely because I saw how Palestinianism was created and indulged and fueled I see no reason that it could not be uncreated. So
on that point, I mean, generally when people look towards World War II, they think about, what changed the German and the Japanese perspective was a traumatic shock to the system, right? Defeat, but defeat that came with a lot of destruction and death and like awful things, right? So that kind of shocked the system, and then people woke up and said,
and continuous occupation afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
indoctrination.
People woke up and said, okay, maybe we got something wrong, and then they started considering, and then it took years, but eventually. Do you think, we've been seeing a lot of videos coming out of Gaza about people shouting at Hamas and how they basically want to disconnect from the Hamas leadership, and they hate Hamas and Gazans, Palestinians. Do you buy it? Do you think that there is some shift after the extensive destruction that's happened in Gaza? Do you think there's some shift in the Palestinian ethos, or do you think not much has changed so far?
So I'll separate. First of all, one thing that I vow to myself is to listen to the Arabs in general, but the Palestinians in particular, with no wishful thinking. So I listen to what they say in Gaza. Yeah, some of them are very angry at Hamas. None of them, I listened very carefully, none of them challenge the Palestinianist ethos.
I saw a video. I don't know how much of it was like directed, but where people were saying, we want Israel over Hamas. We want Israel to rule us.
That's this conversation of like, we're angry at Hamas. They're angry at Hamas for having failed. They were euphoric on October 7th, but I have not heard anything yet that challenges the Palestinianist ethos. Asking Israel to rule them, ironically, does not challenge it. Just like when people say, we just want one state, it doesn't challenge it. I have not heard anyone yet say, the century we spent, our people, our resources, our time, everything we had, we threw at trying to destroy the Jewish state. How stupid was it? Didn't hear that yet. So again, I'm no wishful thinking. They haven't said that yet. But here we go to the Japan and Germany example. It wasn't just the ruin and the destruction. The destruction and the ruin were the condition for unconditional surrender and defeat. There had to be a certain clarity that they were defeated. After World War I ends with armistices. So essentially ceasefires. As a result, Germany emerges and say, hey, we were actually going to win, and this was stolen from us, and everyone's being unfair to us. And this is the soil on which Nazism grows, and ultimately appeasement, because there was no clarity. So after World War II, or during World War II, the Allies say, okay, this time there's going to be no question as to who lost and who won. And there's going to be unconditional surrender, not even conditional. And from that clarity, so it's not the ruin itself. You can go through ruin and still believe the same terrible things you believed before, personally and collectively. What was important here was the combination of the ruin with the surrender and then with the charting a new course.
You wouldn't get to the surrender without the ruin.
I agree, but what I'm saying is we are now at a point that I genuinely fear that we might actually waste the ruin. What does it mean? Because, okay, there's ruin, but there was ruin in the past. And for me, the tragedy of the conflict is that every time that the Palestine Arabs, every time the Palestinians could have looked at the disaster, which was their ideology, and say, maybe it wasn't such a great idea. Every time they could have gone, and there were always others who were happy to help them, to say, no, you change nothing. You're lovely, just as you are. Your ideology is wonderful. Change nothing. It's evil Israel. We're going to send you billions to reconstruct. And then, so we need to actually, the ruin right now is an opportunity.
But do you think there's enough ruin? Because if you compare it to the ruin that had to take in Germany and Japan, it's a nothing burger.
Oh no, proportionally, we're there. Proportionally, we're talking. Look, there were 60. There were 60 million Japanese. 300,000. Do the numbers. I did them. Proportionally, we're in a similar place. For me, the question is, what do we do with the ruin? If the ruin, we leave it and then there's ceasefire and the billions go back, then we will have misused one of the biggest opportunities to change course.
But there is no willingness on the side of the Palestinians to surrender, to have unconditional surrender.
Has anyone even demanded that? I mean, we can't expect them to come up with it when we're not even demanding
Have we not?
No, not
Return
really.
of the hostages and unconditional surrender has been
No, you've made that up. Return of the hostages, yes, and defeating Hamas. No, but we didn't put on the table that either Hamas or the Palestinian Authority, or if there's no collective surrender, I'm in favor of individual surrender. Designate an area in Gaza, let's say in the north, and say, look, if your leaders refuse to surrender, we're creating the safe place, safe zone, where if you want to individually surrender the ideology of Palestinianism, you make sure that you're expunged from the records of UNRWA as a refugee, you tape a declared statement that you don't want from the river to the sea, you just want to live next to a Jewish state, you're understanding that you're not a refugee and there's no right of return, then you can go in. So if not collective surrender, then individual surrender. But are we even demanding that? We're not. It's not part of the discourse. It's the discourse of some people on Twitter, but it's not the clear demand of the government of Israel. And I would say, because this is, I think, an issue that we often have, we turn things that we believe are not likely or not possible into an ideology. So ahead of time, we assume that something is not going to happen, and then we conduct ourselves as if it's not going to happen, rather than saying, we don't know if it's going to happen, but this is what should happen. And that's our vision, and this is an opportunity. And if anyone in the world now will have any other message to the Palestinians except, look at where your stupid choices have led you. Look at where your terrible ideology has led you. Look at the ruin. There will be no reconstruction. No dollar will flow in until you change course, until your ideology is defeated and you acknowledge defeat. We're not saying that.
And if we did and it wouldn't work, what then would you do?
So I don't believe in this kind of if we did and it wouldn't work. You do that. And you do everything based on that vision. Sometimes you have no choice and you compromise, but the vision is clear. You don't change the vision. And right now, we're not even putting the vision out there. We're not putting the vision of the end of the ideology of Palestinianism, nothing less.
So, I mean, many Israelis would say, or at least a lot of the discourse in the media has been about the fact that, the people to bring about that change, not specifically the one that you're speaking about, but any kind of shift in direction need to be a whole new group of people than the ones that we currently have. So let's talk a little bit about what's ahead. Why is the government that kind of brewed this mess, or not just the government specifically, the 120 people that are in Knesset right now that were there pre-October 7th, why are they still there? When do you expect to see elections coming? What do you think is going to be the shift in the political map? Like, how do you see things practically, less ideologically, but how do you think practically moving forward?
First of all, there's always a time lag between changes in society and their political expression. So let's say when Trump was elected in 2016, everyone said, oh, this is the outcome of the 2008 crisis. Okay, everyone kind of drew that line. But no one knew to say it before that. So there will be political expression. October 7th does not leave a society unchanged. But sometimes it takes time to work it. So this is why I use the vote in the Knesset. This is the same members of Knesset but they already seem to operate on behalf of a somewhat changed people. So there's this kind of meme that goes around on the internet, and I think it comes from this medieval historian that says that good times create soft leaders, right? Soft leaders create terrible times create strong leaders create good times. So we had soft leaders creating terrible times. I have no doubt that from the cauldron of Israel right now, of people mobilizing and sacrificing and rising to the moment, the leadership will emerge, the language will emerge, the ideas will emerge, but it's still kind of happening. So will it happen in the next election? Will it happen in an election after that? I don't know. I'm not sure it really matters. The expectation that the change will be the next day, that's the weird thing. Mm-hmm. Like, I know that we feel that like something so big had to create a change immediately.
Yeah.
But it doesn't.
Yeah, it didn't work like that also in the 70s, right?
Yeah, and human beings don't work like that.
Do you think politically everybody's too afraid to be the one that breaks up this wartime coalition, so it's bound to sort of see itself through? Do you think we're going to see a full term?
That could happen. I mean,
because it seems like a taboo right now to step
and everyone
away.
has their interests in staying, and no one right now has an interest in going out.
Do you think there should be elections now? Or should we? You don't.
I don't. The elections themselves don't. In themselves, I don't think they're a goal. Mm-hmm. To have elections. Like, should we have early elections or elections in time? For me, the question is, do we have new ideas, new ways of thinking about our reality that will make an early election worthwhile?
You presented a new idea, so may we see that idea represented in an election whenever it may come?
I'm definitely considering how to find a way to see if my ideas have relevance politically, or am I just, or they make for fun podcasts and that's it. But, over the years, people often ask me, who shares your ideas in Israel? Because they didn't fall conveniently into any kind of bucket of left or right. And I would say, look, it's either 5 people, they're my best friends by now, or it's 80% of the Israeli public. And someone recently told me, I thought it was beautiful. He said, Einat, there are moments when what 5 people believe becomes what 80% supports. So the question is, do my ideas reflect quirky thinking that is like fun to play with? Or do they reflect a broad Israeli Zionist consensus? And I do want to check that. And I started I used to speak almost exclusively to foreign audiences. Now I speak more in Israel when invited. So I might do more on that and see where it goes. See if those ideas have resonance or not.
Is there another book in the works post October 7th, maybe?
So Adi and I are working on updating the War of Return to essentially reflect the years that have passed and what October 7th meant, with the main message that October 7th is the Palestinian vision of return. So we're updating the book, and I'm working maybe on a couple other writing projects.
Okay.
Do you fear another October 7th, let's say from the Ramallah front? And if so, what should we this time do something about it up in advance and maybe call for their surrender, giving up the ideology, like you say in Gaza? Maybe we should do it in Judea and Samaria beforehand, or else?
As a rule, yes. I think that the ideology of Palestinianism is not limited to the people of Gaza. It is the ideology of the Palestinians. That's their identity. And yes, I think Whereas Gaza could be a good place to start, it should be far from the place that it should not be isolated to it. And we should be under no illusion that this is not happening among the Palestinians of the West Bank. It'll be interesting to see what opportunities open up in Syria and Lebanon right now to finally put to rest.
But to implement your ideology on a case where October 7th hasn't happened yet,
yes,
right?
Which is
to
why
prevent the next October 7th. So I should start causing ruin in Ramallah and in Jenin, and I should be the initiator. Of this, I should engage in war.
But this time,
with them.
First of all, we are at war, and I think
but we don't cause ruin, right?
Okay. So again, the ruin in itself is not a goal. Even if you look in the Japanese case, it's fascinating. The Allies made a declaration in July 1945, the Potsdam Declaration, in which they had an incredibly shiny, positive vision for Japan. So they basically said, you could be this country that disavows war, that is a democracy, that lives in peace, or there will be, I think the term was utter and immediate destruction. So there was a choice. I think this is really important, that there be a choice.
But you can't bluff a choice like that.
Of course not. They can't.
We can't.
No, I think that's what Noah is saying, is that like if you make that kind of
ultimatum. Of course. Yes, I agree. Of course. And the ultimatum, again, it doesn't have to be just go and destroy buildings. It could be about money. It could be about, you could make it about quite a few things, but you begin to have that clarity of vision of what we expect. And I think we do need to understand that we're also at war in the West Bank. This is, I think, the clarity that I think more Israelis have now. Our enemy is not Hamas. Our enemy is the Palestinianist ideology and identity, and it needs to be transformed everywhere.
By any means necessary.
Again, by the threat of the use of force, yes.
And
but again, I think
implementation, if it gets there.
What would surrender by the PA look like? Meaning stopping to pay the families of terrorists,
like for slay,
stopping
the surrender is the following. They basically sign to the following agreement, and I'll explain what the details are. But they say, we, as representative of the Palestinian people, on behalf of all the Palestinian people, hereby declare that our century-long war against Zionism is over. We want to live in peace next to the sovereign state of the Jewish people and not from the river to the sea. We recognize that we are no longer refugees. This has a list of actions. Close down UNRWA, there's no refugee, no camps. Basically, all of that is gone. We are not refugees. We do not possess a right of return into the sovereign state of Israel. And we say that on behalf of the entire Palestinian people, no exceptions. That's what...
More or less.
Not more or less, exactly.
More, not less.
Exactly that.
Okay. Ambitious.
Does she have your vote? I'm just
but
we're
no,
starting an early poll.
No, she doesn't
poll.
because I feel like we're I don't know, we're sliding a bit from the reality where it's a nice ultimatum and there's a carrot and a stick. The carrot to me is science fiction. Like, it is obvious. We can, for the fun and games, we can present them with the choice, but I think it's clear that it's a non-starter. It's a non-choice because they will never, I respect them enough to know that they will never choose what you present to them.
So the word never.
Not in my lifetime, okay? Maybe our great-grandchildren, but not in our lifetime. So given that, I don't hear from you a clear stick. The stick is not clear enough for me to vote for you. So
the stick is, again, the stick doesn't have to be.
To me, the stick is if you don't. I go with your carrot.
Yes.
I take the carrot. Okay, carrot sounds great. If they accept that, great. But if not, I am not interested in their presence at all in my border, and I will remove them from my land. That's the stick I want to hear from you, from anyone who wants to, that I think it should be the stick also in Gaza. Like if
I think also there's a problem with the carrot, which is why I said more or less, which is I don't necessarily see impossible that a Palestinian leadership would sign that,
would
but
lie
then
about it,
not
yeah.
care about it the next day. I mean,
No,
that's
they
similar to what we saw previously.
No.
Right?
They never, on this, so first on this, they do not lie because it is their identity. It's not like saying open air prison or genocide on that. This is their identity. So they cannot lie on that. They need to become a different people in order to be able to say that. So it's not something that they can just say. And I've checked it in a variety of ways.
In Oslo, there wasn't something similar?
No. That's the thing. I've developed over the years a musical ear. I'll give you a couple of examples, but on Oslo, first of all, Oslo was a temporary mechanism. So it did not demand that they make the final kind of decision. In 2000, Barak demanded that they choose, and they made the choice. They don't want a state if it means that the Jews have a state. But for Oslo, they didn't need to make a choice. They went to an interim process. But in Oslo, they said 2 states. But if you ask them, and again, we have all the documents from the time, the right of return is sacred, holy, non-negotiable. Like they were very, very clear on that. We just didn't take it seriously. But I'll give you 2 recent examples. A few years ago, I gave a talk to a delegation of students who was here in Israel. And the delegation, so at the end of the talk, there was one student there, non-Jewish, and she was the head of Students for Justice in Palestine in her university. By the way, that's why they're called Students for Justice in Palestine. Apropos West-plaining. Most Westerners hear justice. Sure, they need to get a state, freedom, dignity. Justice to them is only one. It's correcting the injustice that is the very creation of Israel. This is why it's not called Students for an Independent State of Palestine. No, nothing that is an actual achievable goal. So I end my talk and she said, you just said that Palestinians don't want peace, which is not what I said. I'm very careful about my language. I said that there was never in the last century an Arab-Palestinian vision of peace where there was a Jewish state anywhere to be found. But she heard that I said that Palestinians don't want peace. And she continued and she said, that's not true. I want peace. Now, at this point, 99.99% of people would be like, ha, Einat is wrong. Palestinians want peace.
Define peace.
Precisely. So I told her, what does peace look like? And then a fascinating exchange ensued. She could not utter a vision of peace where there was a Jewish state. She just kept justifying. She said things like, but Zionism is racism, but how you treat these people, but what you do here, but what you do there. But she couldn't. She just couldn't. And I've had this happen in a variety of ways. It's just that nobody ever bothers to question them, to really nail them down on their vision. So on this, they do not lie. Now, to your question of never, that's actually critical to my thinking. I would always joke that never is a long time. But beyond that, for the last century, I think we had many moments where we tried to do shortcuts, where we tried to make peace now, where we tried to negotiate with the Palestinians to end all issues and be done with it. Or we tried to just disengage. Let's just get out of the West Bank. Let's just get out of Gaza. But the idea was that we try to do it now. I believe that if we go with a long-term vision, which we say, this is what it looks like, this obsession with the non-existence of the Jewish state ceases to be who you are, that's our vision, and then we become like the people of the desert, however long it takes. I argue, I suspect, that if we will have this attitude, rather than the one that demands now, including what you're saying. Throw them away. Get them away. I try to ask people who say that. Like, we just don't want to see them there. They go to what? Across the Jordan River?
Yes.
How does that make it better? Because the problem is not...
They're further away.
Is that really the problem, whether they are 15 kilometers from you or not? So I want to argue that no. I want to argue that that's not the problem. Again, I'm not against if people want to go more, they're more than welcome, happy to facilitate that, on one condition, that we don't send them to nice countries or countries that matter. Because if we send
Then
them
our
to...
vacations would be ruined.
Not the vacations, with all due respect to vacations, it's the Jewish people that I care about. If you send them to a Canada,
vacations.
if you send them to a Germany, to Britain, ultimately this ideology is so toxic and destructive that if you basically send it somewhere else, it still is radioactive. So if you're going to send them anywhere, let it be Algeria. Let's say a country that, as it is, it's deeply anti-Semitic, so it won't make a difference. But I actually think that we need to stop running away from coming to terms with this ideology and have this self-respect of demanding its transformation.
Amen.
Okay.
I think as a wish, it's a beautiful wish. I don't know if I agree.
It's a
Yeah,
vision.
like
It's a vision, and it's a guiding North Star. It's more than a wish. It means that you begin to align everything you do to that vision.
Yeah.
It's not like a birthday wish.
No, of course.
Yeah,
not.
but
Yeah.
We wish for our
But,
vision to
They navigate by other stars.
fine.
So
But-
you can navigate by the northern star, but they look at the other stars. So question is,
Which is why we need to navigate by that star, because otherwise...
tell you what, to me, I'll be a bit blunt. It's a bit patronizing approach. I feel. Because, you know more than them. You know what's good for them more than them. No, they know what's good for them.
No,
Not less than you.
No, they don't know what's good for them. They
No,
know what they
no.
want
Th-
right now. but
They,
they don't
to
necessarily.
them, that's what's good for them.
I agree.
And what you say is irrelevant to them right now. Otherwise, they would already believe it by themselves. Yeah, like you're the savior who comes and tells them what's
I'm not
you
the
know,
savior. I
I'm
think
making it a bit blunt,
No,
just for the sake of the
but it's more
of the
than that,
podcast. But
because-
you know what I'm saying? It's like
I know, and
who are you?
I guess I have
or
failed it.
Who are we to tell them?
we're not telling them. In that I agree with you, we respect them by demanding what we need for us. So I'm not saying that it's good for them.
What do they care? What we need?
What?
Do they care?
Because otherwise they're paying a price for what. But this is
Okay.
the fact that again and again you do what I think again is where we fail. We take things that we assume, and as a result we make it our ideology. I'm not saying that it's good for them and they need to want it. We need to be the ones who present this vision. It's first about us having a sense of backbone and self-respect, because the problem is that we constantly make excuses for them. Absolutely, precisely because I respect them, that they are incredibly serious about their ideology, about who they are. I'm making it clear because who they are and their ideology is dangerous to me as it stands. I make it clear that from my perspective, I will not let it stand. I think it's the absolute minimum, rather than to begin to say this will never happen, therefore I will never expect it. That's what I think we should
Fair
do.
enough.
All right. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. We really
Sure.
appreciate it. Really appreciate it. So your books are available on Amazon.
War of Return is the latest.
There's the We Should All Be Zionists, which is a book of essays, which is a bit more recent.
Ah, okay. So it's an essays, but The War of Return is a full...
Is a regular book.
And there will be a new version coming up.
Well, first we're working on Hebrew.
Okay, and
take
then
some
in
time,
English.
and then hopefully.
And
English too.
you're very active on Twitter,
Yes.
also in English.
Yes.
So what's your handle on Twitter? Einat Wilf?
Einat Wilf.
Okay.
Yeah. Easy to find.
And that is it, I think.
Yeah.
Right? Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. See you on the next one, guys.
See you on the next one.
Bye.
Bye.